And so for our next speaker, also somebody who, as they say, doesn't need any introduction, but I'm going to introduce him anyway. So a former ambassador, a microbiologist, Dublin born, also Trinity College Dublin, senior fellow in the EU Affairs, PhD in biochemistry, part of the Irish government talks on the Good Friday, the Belfast Agreement, headed up the Irish Consular Service and Irish Abroad for 6 years in the diplomatic service as Irish ambassador to Canada, Jamaica and the Bahamas. And since his retirement in 2016, a columnist in the Sunday Business Post. So ladies and gentlemen, please give a rousing welcome to Dr. Ray Bassett.
Thank you very much, and at the very outset I just want to congratulate Harman for organising this conference, giving me the opportunity to say and Harman, at the risk of stealing some of your lines, I think this is the first time a political party has been established where people paid to come in, so it's a very good job. And again, at the risk of sounding like a mutual admiration society, I'm delighted to be in the presence of Ray Kinsella and the other speakers. Myself and Ray have spoken at a number of meetings, and at a very early stage I think we were very much voices in the wilderness, but it seems to be, things seems to be changing. And last night I was at a meeting in Dublin, again on the same subject, and there was only standing room. So obviously, whereas the opinion polls might show it, there's certainly interest in this area. I want to say that I'm speaking here, as Ray did, as an independent. For nearly 40 years I've worked for the Irish government, a big organisation, and I greatly value the ability to say what I think now, not what I'm paid to say. So when you see people on spokesmen, they're often paid. So the only advice I'd say is be true to yourself, even if it's unpopular, and it doesn't make you some friends in certain places. I think the foundation of this party and the general discussions which are taking place at long last about our nature of our relationship with the European Union are very, very badly needed. You know, I often listen to Irish politicians talk about the British media and say it's terrible the way they write about the European Union, but the suffocating uniformity of Irish media and mainstream coverage on Europe. And in some of the mainstream papers here in the Republic, there is an editorial policy. So even if the individual journalist was quite interested in what you're saying and what you, and maybe even has some sympathy for it, they're unlikely to get a proper hearing in the paper. And they will tell you that privately, that essentially the paper has a policy, and if you don't fit into the policy, then you don't, it doesn't get in. Now, and anyone who's challenging the power of the European Union, you've got to realise the kind of forces that are against you in Ireland. There's a huge EU industry in Ireland, and a lot of it is being supported by taxpayers' money. An awful lot of academics who come out and produce papers in Europe, they're all being funded by organisations, by funding from Europe. Now, there really isn't any funding from Europe. They're being funded by Irish taxpayers. And I always have a smile when I hear we get funding from Europe. Europe uses member states' funds, and there are people, often in discussions I often saw with academic and other people, I say, would you declare whether you've ever got a grant from Europe? Because I'm not saying that doesn't make your point valid, but I think it's a pertinent fact that you've had a material advantage from your pro-European stance. Now, I remember when I was still in the civil service, and I made a suggestion once at a meeting, which almost got me lynched. My view was that anybody who negotiates with the European Union, the Irish government side, should be statutorily barred from taking a job with the European Union for at least 5 years. Because there's such an obvious conflict of interest. The number of politicians and officials who regularly slip from Ireland into European institutions and back again, and yet how often the interests of Brussels and the interests of Dublin are not the same. So how can you be sure that the person is acting purely in the interests of Ireland if they've got an eye on a job? And the other question I often ask is, with all this Euro enthusiasm, why do we have to pay all these people huge amounts of money? You know, because if somebody moves from a job in Dublin to a job in Brussels, they massively improve their financial circumstances. If people believe in this European business, why do we have to do, as Bevan said about the doctors in the NHS, why do we have to stuff their mouths with gold? Why don't they do it out of conviction? Why do we have to make special arrangements for children of EU officials? Why do they charge a special tax rate and various things like that? And to be honest with you, that's a form of payola. That's corrupting the whole... So if you're setting out to confront the Irish settled policy on the European Union, remember there's a lot of very powerful vested interests out there who are not going to give you a fair shake and are going to feel threatened by what you say. And in fact, inside government apparatus, I was always struck at how sensitive they were to criticism of Europe. Given the opinion polls, you would imagine that the pro-European element in Ireland would be very, very confident and be quite delighted to have discussions. And yet when you have somebody like Tony Coughlin or Patricia McKenna or Raymond Crotty starting asking for fairness in referenda, it causes a huge reaction. A reaction that's never written about, but there's almost a hyper reaction against it, which makes me feel all the time that the actual basis on which the pro-European feeling is sitting isn't that strong after all. Now, the general drift of pro-European propaganda, or a sort of a sacred cow syndrome that you cannot question Europe, does have detrimental effects in Ireland, and it's part of the reason why we've got into such a mess on Brexit. Now, it was Brexit which got me to start writing, because I'd spent the vast majority of my time in the north, and talking to some of the negotiators who were involved in Brexit, it was quite clear that they had no idea of the painstaking efforts by huge elements, civic society, governments and all, to put together a peace process in Ireland. Because when I suggested that, maybe we should be very sensitive to Britain because we rely on them to maintain the Good Friday Agreement, and I was told that that wasn't the situation, that I was one of the dinosaurs, that in fact our relations with Britain were not of that high value. Our future lay in Brussels. And I was also told, which I was never told before, is no matter what the outcome of the Brexit negotiations, Ireland was going to be on Team EU. Now, I have never heard of negotiations where we went in and we had no bottom line. The bottom line was we were going with Europe. And that, I think, is from several generations of pro-EU propaganda. So when the Cameron negotiations came up, and it was quite obvious that Brexit represented a threat to Ireland if it went through, Ireland did not help in getting any decent reforms. Cameron was left completely with nothing really to go on to the referendum. In fact, in the referendum itself, the Cameron reforms weren't even mentioned. And Ireland, and again arguing inside, said, why don't we do this? He said, well, look, Ireland and Britain are close together. There's always a suspicion in Brussels that we might be a bit soft. So we've got to be one of those people who are determined to maintain the integrity of the union's legal order, something that you will hear all the way through. And of course the experts who had all come in recently all said that there's no possibility of Brexit being carried. And if it's carried, the British government will ignore it and various things like that. So, coming from a scientific background, Albert Einstein said the definition of insanity is trying the same experiment over and over again and expecting a different result. We're doing exactly the same thing as we did with the Cameron Free negotiations. We're not taking our national interests into consideration. We're being subservient to Brussels.